Hi everyone, this is Patrick from 8-Bit Doodads with another SepTandy video. This is our continuation series on the Model 4P. You might remember we did a quick look on the 4P, and today we're actually going to be diving into doing some upgrades and actually running some of my favorite software on the Model 4P.
Say, kids, what time is it?
It's 8-Bit Doodads time!
Following that quick look video did on the 4P, I decided to, go ahead and do some routine tests. And in fact, this machine was given to me by a fellow member of the Florida Retro Computer Group. And not only did he give me the 4P system, he also provided me with a handful of diskettes that work on this machine. And of course, my first thought was, okay, let's put a disk in and let's boot up the system. And in fact, we can do that now. And it takes a second for the screen to warm up, and you can see it boots the disk well. I put in a very particular disk. I then started to go through the other discs it gave me, and every other one was giving me a read error. And I thought that's strange. And then I came back to the same diskette and found, oh, wait, it wouldn't boot anymore. So I thought there might be a problem with the floppy drive. And that's why you see there's an external floppy drive here that would have been in this spot. And so one of the first things I decided to do was, okay, I need to open this up, and just to test, I wanted to exchange the two floppies that were in it in case maybe this thing has a head alignment problem, or the heads were clean, or, one of the things you notice on these older floppies is they use a belt, and sometimes these belts can get loose, and there were replacement belts for them to tune them up. So it could be any one of those number of problems. And I wanted to check whether it was the floppy drive. So I actually did do the swap out, and all of a sudden I noticed the new drive could read all of my floppies. And in fact, one of my floppies, they came in here, and if you watch the quick look, you'd know I want to install what's called a FreHD, which is a hard drive emulator for the TRS-80 Model 134, but also they've now made it available for the 2, 12, and 16 series. That was my ultimate goal, was making them work. And there was a floppy that came with it that I knew was new and knew it being 2 years old, and it wouldn't boot at all. As soon as I switched the floppy drives, that floppy booted no problem. So I proceeded to open up the machine, and we're going to be doing that in a few minutes. And I swapped out the drives, or moved the cable from this drive to this other drive, and this drive performed well. So I know there's some issue with this floppy drive. It could be just that it needs its heads cleaned. It could be that the belt on the drive needs to be replaced, that it's not working as well as it is. Before going down the path of replacing this, that wasn't critical to my need of getting the hard drive emulator working. I just needed a floppy drive to do boots, but I also thought, okay, what about getting new software on here? And so I went down the path of looking at this thing. This is a Gotek floppy emulator, which is normally used with a IBM PC and some other systems, but they have some additional firmware that you can replace on this controller, and it's supposed to be able to emulate a Tandy floppy drive. And my intention was to put this in the machine And I actually found I had a plastic carrier that could mount it and look like a 5 1/4 inch floppy drive. And I'll be honest with you, I spent almost 2 weeks trying to get this to work. Part of the issue is you have to replace the firmware on here with something called Flash Floppy that allows you to, Flash Floppy firmware on here allows you to emulate more kinds of floppy drives. But the other thing is, because the connector here is different than the connector that you would normally find on a Tandy floppy. In fact, I'll show that to you. Ooh. Trying to get it. This has that standard flat pin, which in fact maybe this will show you better. It uses this kind of wide connector that fits on there. This is what the connector would have been on an original IBM PC floppy drive. And in fact, these tandem drives are made the same way. The difference between this drive and an IBM PC floppy drive is largely is that this is one-sided and the 360K floppy drive in a PC was two-sided. And you'll notice this uses the pins, which is the typical connector in a 3.5-inch drive that would have been in later PCs. The ribbon cable inside the Model 4P has two of these kind of connectors on it that connect up to the two of these 5 1/4-inch drives. And so you either need an adapter, which they are available online, and in fact I've ordered one now, so I may still be going down this path, but I didn't have one. And what I attempted to do in getting the Gotek to work is I found an old floppy drive cable, and I tried to pull apart the proper connectors and push them back in to the drive, to the ribbon cable, and use that to make my own custom ribbon cable. After many attempts, I couldn't get floppy images on this to be read by the machine. And I don't know if it's whether it's the cable, whether I didn't do the flashing the firmware right, and I didn't want to keep beating on that dead horse, so to speak. So I've decided to put the Gotek aside for now, and I'm going to come back to it, and I'm going to get the appropriate adapters that will allow to go into it. As I said, my main goal was to implement the hard drive emulator, and this is that hard drive emulator, which you can see there's an SD card. This also not only emulates a hard drive, it also emulates a real-time clock for the machine, and it has a cable for Tandy's expansion port that's on the back of this machine. It's also on the bottom back of Model 3s, and there's even a way to connect this up to a Model 1. So this is what I wanted to connect in. Now, one of the things you'll see is this has that expansion interface cable, which is a wider cable than you have on the floppies. It also has a power cable, and there are power cables that will drop into a standard Molex connector that you would find for a regular floppy drive. My original thought was I have one of those cables with the pins, and it just needs 5 volts of power, and I thought I'll connect up an external power supply and power it that way. And using, my first thought was use a USB brick, which gives you 5 volts, and wire a USB cable into this, but I wasn't sure what the power draw of this was. So then I could go to a wall wart 5 volt unit and provide it power. But since I only have one working floppy drive at the moment, and there is actually a spare connector in there for power. And rather than having something outside the machine, what I thought I would do is use that same case I was going to use for the Gotek floppy emulator, is that we would take this hard drive emulator, place it inside this case where the SD card was available on the outside, and that we would install it in this empty slot that the floppy drive was taking up. Other people have done this customization and in fact have 3D printed cases that do this work, that make it all clean. That's something I may do down the road. I just want to demonstrate right now that we can get the emulator working, we can get the machine booting from disk images that are on the emulator, and we can power it from internally in the machine. That's going to require us finding a way to route this cable to the expansion port on the back and for mounting this plastic carrier. I will tell you, when I was first playing with this with the Gotek, this carrier didn't sit flush with the other drive, so we may have to be making some modifications to make that happen. But I'm confident that we can get this mounted to here and we can get this carrier positioned correctly in this case. So to start with, let's turn off the machine, and I'm going to slide the keyboard back in because I do want to show you something. We're going to tilt this down so you can see the back. And in fact, here is the I/O expansion port, and that's what this card plugs into. And normally this is an expansion port with card that you would have something outside the machine. And in fact, this machine could have supported one of those big 8-inch Tandy hard drives. I think they had 12 megabyte, and they might have had 5 or 6 megabyte hard drives, and they might have, I think they had larger later in life. So we're going to want to plug into that. But given that we want to go inside the machine, we want to look for a way to route the cable from here and bend it back inside the machine. So that's one of the things. So the first thing, obviously, is taking off the cover. And I have one of my electric screwdrivers, which we can use. And it took me, the first time I did this, it took a little while to figure out. There are 4 screws, and of course I'm not even using the electric screwdriver. There we go. There are 4 screws, 2 on each side. And as I said, the first time I did this, I took out these 4 screws and I kept pulling on the cover to try to get it off, and I never could get it off. And thank you, YouTube, watching somebody else. And it may have been Adrian's Digital Basement, who had a teardown video where he was doing some work in this. And I saw what the secret was. And the secret was, see the handle here? There are 2 screws holding this handle down. And I may have to use, because of how deep those screws are in there, let me grab another screw bit. And I'll use a longer screw handle. So these 2 screws holding in the handle, which you think that's all they do is hold the handle in, but the truth is they're holding the case. And now I can just lift the case off. And of course, inside the case was this keyboard. And now you see the machine exposed. And if I should, let me tilt this back up for a second. There's a little rubber thing here that's inside the case. That's all about protecting the keyboard cable, and then when you set it down, it's supporting the machine so it's not crushing the cable. And now you see the machine, and over here is the disk drives. And here I'll bring up, if you can see it, that's that kind of floppy controller. And when I said earlier about adapting the Gotek to it, those aren't the same. There are some available cards that plug in there that convert from this connector to that connector, and that's what I'm going to order so that we might eventually put the Gotek in here. The floppy drives are contained in this case here on the side. In fact, I'll turn it up, and you can see there's screws holding this, and the floppy drives are mounted to this plate. There's another plate here, and underneath here, and this is where you need to be careful, you get exposure to the tube, and you have to be worried about electrical discharge from that tube. So you want to be careful about opening up that plate. But going back up, we have the floppy controller that plugs into the motherboard, and we also have two power connectors, and you'll see there's since I don't have a second drive plugged in, a second power connector, and so we can use that to plug our adapter in and plug in our hard drive emulator and get it mounted inside the case. I will tell you, with this particular piece of plastic that I had, we'll get it in here, and we could have mounted the Gotek if we got it working. We're going to mount the hard drive emulator in that same space. I think there's enough space in here that ultimately what I'd like to do is be able to get both of these devices mounted in that space so that we can have a real working floppy drive, the Gotek emulator so we can load floppy images onto our machine, and the hard drive images, and that we would have both the Gotek's port out the front for being able to plug and unplug a USB device, but also the SD card out front so we can change hard drive images as we need to. There are people who have made 3D printed custom versions of this to mount both the Gotek, but also to mount the floppy drive emulator. I would like to come up with something that could mount both of those in that space, and we could put in a Y cable for the power adapter that can supply power to both of these devices. So my next step is to remove this panel, this cage, you might say, for the floppy drives so that we can mount our devices in it. There are a couple screws here. Some are obvious, like this one right here. And there are 4 along the front of that. And of course, you go to take them out. And you're ready to pull the cage out, and it doesn't seem to go. And it took me a little while to investigate this to realize there are 2 hidden screws in this space down here mounting this cage down, attaching the cage down in the bottom of the cage to the same place. I don't know if you can see it. So there are screws here. There are screws here holding that cage in. So we need to remove all those screws to get this whole thing to come out. Now, because of the way those screws are in, as you can imagine, I can't get my electric screwdriver down in there, which is why I went and made the little one. And we got to put it down in here. There we go. And it's actually hard to see in there. There we go. We got one. And having already done this, at least I know where the screws are and can feel them by touch. And there's the other one. So that should allow this cage to move out. Oh, sorry. 2 more screws. These screws attach that cage to the front plastic bezel of the machine. One of the things I try to do, and actually I didn't do today, I'm putting all the screws in the same place. I usually use one of the metallic cups that Greg talked about, I believe, on one of his posts that we've gotten. And in fact, I have one of these over here. These are really nice. They expand so they can hold more screws, and they have magnetic bottoms. So when you throw screws into them, they don't go wandering off. So you can see now the cage comes off, and there's the floppy that's still installed. I'd already pulled the other one off. We can pull the ribbon cable off and the power supply. So that's the floppy we have working. Here's that cable that this is the original cable that came with the machine that supports 2 floppy drives. A note on this, because this was really strange to me, and I had to go look at it. If you look at an IBM PC 34, I think this is 34 pins, ribbons, lanes, whatever you want to call it, for 2 floppy drives. You'll see on an IBM PC, they have ribbon cables, and there'll be a twist in the middle. And that twist is helping determine drive 1 and drive 2. If you look really closely, you'll see that there's some of the pins are missing, and that one's the same, but the pins down here that are missing are different. So they used a different system to signify what's drive 1 and drive 2. And I believe this, in the way this set up, this is the drive 1 pin, this is the drive 2 pin. And they use that to determine what's the boot, drive 0 on a Tandy or drive 1. Whereas the PC used a different mechanism. There's another choice, which if any of you work with IDE drives, you know they have the master slave. There is a way for a floppy drive to have select 0, select 1, which says, am I the primary drive or the secondary drive? The Gotek does support that, but that's not what Tandy uses at all. My attempt at trying to get the Gotek to work is I found an old PC 34-pin cable, and I pulled out the appropriate pins from that and took connectors I had and pushed them onto that cable. It's possible my problem is I didn't flash the floppy, put the flash floppy software on here right. I didn't put the configuration right. I didn't build the connector right. I'm going to come back to that, but that's not today's thing. So now that we have this all apart, what we want to do is we want to get this installed on here. And I can tell you from working with trying to get the Gotek on here, you can see that's flush, but the screw holes aren't lining up. And in fact, when you line up the screw holes, it ends up like about that. But unfortunately, when you ended up with it push out like that, then this doesn't go in. So I'm going to have to work on the screw holes for that to get that mounted correctly. But the other thing we're going to have to do is, here we have the floppy controller, which is fine for the floppy we're going to have. We have 2 power connectors, which will give us the 1 floppy and give us the hard drive emulator. But then now looking at from here, we have to figure out how to get from here into here with that ribbon cable. And I believe, and we'll have to verify this, this is the orientation of the ribbon cable. I'll confirm in a minute the pins that it's not the other way around, but I believe this is the way around. So we need to get this to wrap around to here. One method would be some way to do in here, but remember how that caddy arrives in there, we're going to have to bend it around. I think that's one of the reasons they gave us this long cable. The other thing I noticed, and so I'm going to open it up right now so you can see it, is there's this little plate here where optional cards can be installed in the machine. And I think one of the cards is a graphics card, and there might be a modem or some other communications card. But you can see in here there is a card slot, and I can see something there. If I look it up, if you can see down in there, there's definitely a card connector, and you can tell there's a card that goes in here. What I'm looking at is there a way to run the ribbon cable around that way? And to be honest with you, now that I look at it again, there's no way for it to come out this other side. So having said that, I think I'm going to put this card back on, and that our method is going to have to be to come around this way and bend the cable around and in here. And we're going to have to hope that the cable's long enough and we can bend it in the right ways, and we can get it to all the way to the front where this is going to be. That might actually require us, because the length is whatever, I might need to move this drive back over to the first position and use the second position for the FreHD. Okay, what I've decided to do, before I go through mounting the emulator in this and mounting that inside the card cage and everything else, that let's take a step 1 test of plugging in our emulator, which is going to be able to boot Tristos or LDOS or what have you from the hard drive card that's plugged into it, if I load the right images. And the only thing this thing needs is power. So if I use the power connector, and we'll plug that in there. Oop. There we go. And we can turn this down. And then we can give it power from one of these floppy drive connectors. I need to make sure I load the right image on that card. But like this, it should boot up. And if we get it's booting correctly from there, then we can go on to the next step of installing it. If we don't have this working in this configuration, there's no point in trying to configure or work with the mechanics of getting it mounted until we get the drive working and booting on our screen. Okay, so I've plugged our emulator into the Tandy's I/O port, and I connected with our adapter, a Molex to floppy connector power adapter that gives us power. Now, one of the things about the Model 4P, which is unique to all of the Tandy 1, 3, 4 series, is the ROM in the 4P actually has the code in it to boot from a hard drive. Whereas the other earlier models, you actually had to have a floppy in the machine that you booted that then loaded and could mount the hard drives, but they couldn't boot from the hard drives themselves. There are some modified ROMs to go into those other machines that give you this capability, but the 4P had it built in. I've inserted in here an SD card that has the basic hard drive image from the FreHD emulator people. So we're going to turn this on for the first time, and hopefully it will boot from the hard drive. You notice I don't have the floppy installed right now. I've turned on the machine, we got a light, and hopefully we'll get some lights on. And there we go, we got lights, and you saw it blink twice, and we've come up with it's booting from the system. Just to see, get an instance, it took a few seconds for that to come up. And that may have been the warm-up time of the machine itself. I'm going to hit the reset key and see how fast it takes to boot from the hard drive. There you go. It was a little bit quicker there. I think that delay is because it's checking for a floppy drive first. Their default image is LDOS. I have to be honest, I have not kept up with and haven't had on my hands a Model 3 or 4P for a long time. So I can't tell you about every single operating system that these machines use. The original machine operating system for these machines was TRS-DOS, TRS-DOS. But a couple people came up with alternative operating systems. LDOS is one of them. There's some other operating systems, and I want to explore those in future videos. Some of these operating systems were better at handling things like hard drives, where TRS-DOS didn't necessarily have the built-in nomenclature and structure of managing larger volumes, where LDOS, and there's another DOS, I can't remember the name of it, had those built in. You see it's asking for the date time. This is actually a modified version of LDOS. That's one of the things you have to get into. And I've run across this on the original Macintosh operating systems, Apple IIs, almost everything. They don't know anything about dates past a certain date. When they came out, they made the operating system, if it was in 1980 or 84, they thought, oh, okay, 15 years, well, we can go to 1999. And they don't want to know about dates beyond 2000 and what have you. There are patches for many of these operating systems that handle later years. Apple's done the same thing. There are patches for older Macintosh operating systems that have done the same thing. This one happens to actually do that. So today is 09, and it's Friday the 13th. And I'm going to try to put in 24, and it accepted it. I booted from my floppy drives earlier, LDOS, and one of them would not take, it was an unpatched version, it wouldn't take that later date. And I'll put in the time. And you can see it's running from our emulator. You can see the light blink. And we can actually do a directory. And we can see a directory of what it says here is drive 0. But if I do a directory, you see drive 0, and it tells me it's got 3 megs free of 3.2 megs of data space. One of the things when you do a directory in TRS-80 world is it actually gives you a directory of every drive that's mounted. And so it'll come up and tell me drive 1, another 3 meg drive. But now drive 2 is a 12 meg drive. And drive 3 is a 12 meg drive. And I think the image on this card is a 40 meg version, which is that 12 plus 12 plus 3 plus 3. And now it says drive 4 and 5, there's no disk. That would have been the floppy drives that it thinks it has, but since I have them unplugged. So clearly the FreHD is working, the emulator is working, using this power connector is working. So my next step is going to be seeing if we can mount this in the carrier and get it mounted in, I guess you could say, the drive sled, and get this mounted in here. And I want to get it mounted flush. I may have mentioned this before. See where the screw holes are for this? If I line that up, this thing sticks out, which won't allow it to be mounted in here. So I think I'm going to have to get this flush and drill some new screw holes in here to get it mounted in, and then we'll mount that FreHD hard drive emulator onto this surface. Okay, so I found my hand drill, and as I said, I used this in a video before. It just looks like a screwdriver, but part of these kits, they come with, okay, I just poured them all out, a whole bunch of drill bits. I don't know if you can see them. So they come with drill bits. They also come with, there are kits with other bits in them that look like things that you would find on a Dremel. And in some ways, this is like a hand Dremel. The reason you would use one of these is if you're trying to, especially when you're working on retro computers, you don't just want to get out your power drill and start drilling through, because it can be too much power and it can be too inaccurate. It'll just plow through the plastic, and you're trying to, if you're trying, like we're going to be trying to do here, I want to line this case up to be really, flat here, and using a hand drill, you turn it by hand, and you precisely are controlling where the hole's going, and you're not tearing into things. And, if you use a power drill, it has a tendency that if you're off center or something, it'll pull and shift the item you're trying to drill and give you an imprecise hole point. And if it's something like this where we're drilling through plastic, you don't need the power of a drill to do that. You just want to sit there and drill that pilot hole. And as I mentioned earlier, the screws we're having to use are sort of self-tapping screws that will go through the plastic, so it's not a problem. They match up. Okay, so I'm back, and I have my hand drill, and it looks like a screwdriver, and it has a little twisty on this side so that you can hold it down and twist, or if you're twisting like this. I have a whole bunch of screwdrivers here. I'm going to, drill bits. What I'm going to do is put a small bit in. Give me a second. And the head of a hand drill has a carrier just like you'd find on a regular drill. And this twisty top allows you to hold it like this and twist around. And what I'm going to do is put this in the center of the hole with it aligned, and I can sit here and twist, and I'm directly in that center, and I'm through. So I've made that hole. I'm using the smallest bit, but basically I'm trying to mark the center of the holes so that I can then come in with a larger bit, either with a hand drill or a regular drill. So I'm trying to line the fronts up, and you know what I'm going to do? put it like this, then the fronts are lined up. Now I can come here with the center and drill, and there we go. I drilled out that hole. And actually, if I keep doing the same thing, I'll keep the fronts lined up. I can now come to the back, or what would be the bottom, go to the same middle, and drill a hole. And this will give me the same three hole placements that Tandy used to mount their floppy drives. So I've got two holes there, and you can see how forward they are of the original holes, and I drilled another hole there. Now, instead of using that drill bit, I can find a drill bit that's the right size for the shaft of that screw, and that looks about appropriate. And we open up our drill head. And we can use that to enlarge the hole. And there we go. And we can use our screw. If the head of the screw fits in, and once we use a screwdriver on that, it'll open the hole to the full width we need. We can go again with our pilot hole. And not sure where it went. Oh, there we go. I didn't have the drill bit secure enough, and I pushed it into the drill. And we have the third hole. Now, I could be using a regular screwdriver, but you see how quickly I just went through that one. You just sit here and twist a little bit. You know, being plastic, it doesn't take a lot of pressure. So we've made our three holes. We can line that up with our case. Yep, I see the holes are lined up, and it's flush here. So we're good to go. What I think I need to do before I mount this in here is I want to take this emulator and I want to mount it on here such that the SD card is sticking out so that you can push it in, pull it out, and I just lost it, and put a new card in as need be. Now, they do have, on this board, there are holes for mounting it. I'll take a look at whether one option would be to use those holes and put screws down. Another option, quite frankly, is there's I guess this would be the easier way. There's a little space there on each side of this card, and there's holes. I could just simply put a wire wrap around it to hold it in place. The screws, I don't think I want to use anything like a glue, you know, or double stick tape or whatever, because ultimately I want to build an appropriate 3D printed cage here that's ultimately going to hold both of these things, because Okay, so I took a look at the mounting options, and as I said earlier, I look at doing the screws. But what I found is I had some tie wraps that were the perfect size for going all the way around, and I could use the one tie wraps. If you look at the bottom, there happen to be two slits directly where I needed to put a tie wrap that come across the main chip, hold the board in place, and they go in those slots. The only issue I had was, if you look at the surface area, which is the flat part, the tie wrap would have been a part above that. So I just simply cut two slots in that piece of plastic to put the tie wrap down inside of it. And now I can, simply tighten that up. And that holds this in place. So it's not going anywhere. It's flush with the front, so we're good there. I can take my snips, cut off the tie wrap. So now I have something that will go in our drive. We can mount it in the system. I just need to put the screws in to hold it in place, and this should just drop in there. We're still going to have to work on routing this cable around, and we'll get to that next. Let me mount this, and I was going to say, before I mount this and put it in place, I guess I need to get the cable done, because I need to get the cable attached to here. You know what I'll do is I'll take the cable off the back. There we go. Now I can mount the cable to the drive. So that's in place. I can get to this if I need to. I think I won't have that problem. And in fact, if I come from this direction, I can move the drive forward. I just need to make sure so I can still get to that power connector. I may need to put this in place, connect the power connector. Oh, there we go. Yeah, I can still get to this power connector before that's the concern, is I got to install this, and I need to be able to get to the connectors. If I mount the plastic holder, if I hadn't put this in first, I wouldn't have been able to get to the plastic holder, but I can still get to that power connector, so I think I'm safe there. Let me screw the plastic thing in place, and then we'll get the card cage in place, and then decide how we're going to route this cable. Okay, to give you a little update, I got the drives mounted here. I've only put in 2 of the screws. One of the things that, because of this drive cage and the power cable is very short here, and the existing floppy cable is a little bit short, I found you had to sort of have the drive cage out and get the different power connectors connected, and get the floppy drive cable connected. But I have them both connected, and what I've done is I've taken the hard drive connector that goes to the I/O port, and I've taken it down here and around to the bottom, and I'm hoping that I can get this folded and stored underneath the case that's going to go under it. But I have it routed around, so let's take a look and see if it all works. So I'll turn this to the screen, and we'll turn it on. And so we saw a light, and it's checking the floppy drive to see if there's a floppy drive to boot. And there we got, and you saw how fast, once it hit the hard drive emulator, we got LDOS goes up. So our hard drive emulator is installed. It's in this slot. It's using this SD card, which we have full access to since it's in the front. We can also boot if we want to. I'm going to put in, this is running LDOS. That's the partition I have on here. One of the other things I want to accomplish with this machine is the 4P and the 4 are designed or are ready to run CPM. And I'm hoping to run not only TRS-DOS, LS-DOS, and some of the other TRS-DOS compatible DOSes and running standard TRS-DOS software, but I want to run CPM on the machine and run WordStar and DBase and Turbo Pascal. I thought that would be cool. So I'm going to put in that floppy and see if we reset it and see if it'll boot from the floppy. Oh, I guess because it saw the hard drive, it doesn't boot from the floppy. That's interesting. I may have the wrong floppy connect. There are two floppy connectors. I may have them reversed, but I don't think so. Let me turn this off. If you look at the floppy connectors, the way they're oriented is two drives, and that drive is there. So let me try something else. I'm going to pop the SD card out, which will cause it not to boot from the hard drive. And then put in the CPM disk. If it boots from that, that tells me that's drive 0. And it's booting from that. Okay. So what that's telling me is the preference for this machine is if it sees the hard drive, it's going to boot from the hard drive. Which is perfectly fine. When you're using LDOS or some of the other modern DOSes for this machine, they boot from it. Interestingly enough, because of the way CPM works, and this is why I have this floppy, is that CPM can't boot natively from the hard drive. It needs a floppy to boot to load the drivers that patch CPM to say, I see the hard drive. So this hard drive emulator actually comes with CPM images, and we're going to be doing that. But even with that, it can't ever boot the CPM images. You need a floppy drive. But I guess the priority is sort of on other machines, it sees a hard drive that boots from the hard drive first, not the floppy drive. And that's one of the unique things about the Model 4P is the ROM in it can boot from a hard drive directly. I just didn't know, since it's my first experience with the 4P, I didn't know it preferred that. If you're familiar with old IBM PCs would boot from a hard drive, but if you put a floppy into the floppy drive, it will boot from the floppy before going to the hard drive. This seems to be the reverse. If it sees a hard drive that can boot from it, it will boot from it. So we have the machine with our new emulator installed in this spot. It's booting from the emulator. It will boot from a floppy drive. I think there are keys you can press on the keyboard when it's booting to tell it to prefer one over the other. Now, the last thing we need to do, I'll pull out the power port before moving this around. So we need to put this case back on here. And the question is, can we put this case on? You notice where the keyboard is. Keyboard comes out this side. It actually comes out the bottom. It just needs to be below the case. Can we get this cable to lay flat without pinching or doing something else weird? I think that might work. So let's... And there we go. So the case is on. we will take our handle, which I told you has 2 screws in it, that actually hold the case on. And if I can get the... There's 1 screw. Oop. Oh. I'm going to have to take this back off. I didn't put all the screws in holding the drives in, but I'll put this back down. I'll plug our... Hold on. I'll plug our power back on. So this is our closed Model 4P, and you can see that's the cable for the keyboard, and this is where it would normally go in. We'll turn it on, and with the case on, I didn't put the power all the way in. Now see, that's searching on the floppy drive, but that went to the hard drive. And we see LDOS coming up. And if I put in the date and time, now there is a clock card in this thing, so I need to learn about that as to whether I actually need to be putting in the date and time. And we see it comes up the hard drive. The hard drive image that the FreHD people give you gives you multiple partitions on that one hard drive. We can actually do a directory command, and since I'm doing that, hold on, I'm going to put a floppy in because it should give us all the hard drive directories. But when it's done with the hard drive directories, and there's a 12 meg, and 2 4 megs, we should get, and there you go, it's reading the disk that's in the drive, which is a TRS formatted disk, and we should get that directory. Not sure why it's taking so long. Oh, there we go. So now it's giving you a directory of that drive, which is a 180K disk. And it said no drive 5, meaning there was no second floppy drive. So the emulator's working, the floppy's working, it's installed inside the machine. My next steps for this is I'd like to get some software on here, like ScriptSet or Profile Plus, if any of you are familiar with TRS-DOS. And I'm sure there's games and everything that we can try on here. But I've succeeded in my major goal, which was to get this machine working with the hard drive emulator, so I have something that I can put more software on and not just work with 2 floppies. Okay, I'm back for our final segment. I took the cover back off and installed all the screws that I had left off just to do the simple test we did before. So everything is back the way it should be. One other thing I added, in addition to the screws that were in here, there's a plate on the back of the machine where we can see where I snake that ribbon cable around to feed here. There's actually a cover plate that Tandy gives you that goes over that, that covers that I/O slot. But once you put a connector in there, it actually is designed to hold that cable in place, so we don't have to worry about it falling out, or getting loose, what have you. We can turn the machine back on, just make sure it's working and I didn't do something in putting in the rest of the screws. And as you can see, we have a boot screen. Now, the last thing I wanted to do, I mentioned CPM, that I'd like to run CPM on this. The FreHD folks provide you with a CD with various disk images, and one of those images is CPM. So I went ahead and copied that onto this, and I'm going to put this in here. Now, I mistakenly said you had to use a boot disk, that it wouldn't auto boot CPM, and I was making that assumption because my FreHD came with a CPM boot disk. Since went and read a little bit more on getting the CPM loaded when I was making the SD card, and found out, no, you don't actually need the boot disk. The reason this is available is so that if you make blank hard drive images on a card that aren't pre-done for you, you have the utilities to boot CPM to then, create your hard drive images. I'm going to reset the machine since I switched the SD card, and we're going to take a look, see if it hits the FreHD, which it just did. And there we go, CPM's loaded. One of the things I've noticed, and it says A0, so this is a more current version or a later version of CPM than what first came out. CPM has a limitation on how many files you can have in a directory, and one of the ways they overcame that is they allowed you to make user areas, and each user area can then have its own set of files. So especially when you have a hard drive, and if the machine's going to be used by more than one person, they can sort of have their own subdirectory, because subdirectories don't exist on CPM. So it's a way to organize files as well. Just do a little stat command here, and we can see there's 7 megs of free disk space. The images that I put on here actually are 2 HD images that the FreHD reads, and each one of those has 2 CPM partitions. So there's actually 4 drives. In fact, if I do stat B, and I can do the C and D, they all have, B has a little bit more space, 7300K. This one only has 7 megs because CPM is installed on that drive. My next video in the series with the 4P is I want to work on getting programs installed on here and onto the images. I'd like to put WordStar and DBase or what have you and Turbo Pascal on my CPM system. And for the LDOS system, I'd like to put on ScriptSet because I used to know ScriptSet. I noticed earlier when I was exploring this card, the LDOS card, and I'm going to boot it again, that they have LeScript, which I haven't ever used before, so I don't know what the commands are. But they also have Profile loaded. Let me put in the date. Nope. I have to remember what month it is. This is going to bring up a little menu for us to move between the different, we're at drive 0, there's a drive 1, there's basically 4 drive images on here. There's LeScript is on the 3rd drive, and, oh, did I get that right? I know I'd seen DBase on here at one, oh, this is, not DBase, Profile Plus. For some reason, they named it CM as the executable instead of naming it Profile. And you can see here, Profile 4 Plus is running, which is a piece of database software for the Tandy. In fact, I got used to Profile on the Tandy Model 2. I'm going to, as I said, my next video is going to be about getting software on these. And I think the best way to do that, there are several emulators, and there are Windows utilities where you can have a file explorer-like interface where you can drag and drop files back and forth between images. So I can take this SD card out, put it in the Windows PC, mount that hard drive image, move files to it, and then be able to bring it back here. So that will be my method of moving software to the machine until I get the Gotek installed. If you like this video, please hit the thumbs up. We appreciate it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel so you get notifications of our new videos as they come out. Usually on Wednesdays and Saturdays. We release a short one on Wednesdays and a longer one on Saturdays, like this one. And occasionally we drop a little bit extra video on a Monday or Thursday. You can also visit us on 8bitdoodads.com or our Facebook page, 8bit Doodads.